Airports are excellent places to people watch. Not only that, but if you are tuned in enough to be able to pick out the plethora of emotions they give off, you can almost drown in the intoxicating mix of pure raw feeling these places collect over the years. It was the same for any place people congregated in numbers, they'd leave it behind them like a wake, but there was something about airports that made the sensation stronger still. Maybe it was because no matter where you look there is always some drama playing out, a tearful reunion here, an emotional farewell there, combined with the more mundane, a bored businessman making his 10th trip this year to some Eastern European city most people have never heard of, or the poor sap who works behind the counter of W.H. Smith's, who despite working in an airport has never actually flown in his life. The air is electric with second-hand humanity in places like these. And as such they are a great place to soak it all up if you have all but none left of your own. Randall could feel it in the air like static before a thunderstorm. It made him feel both exhilarated and depressed all at the same time. To be surrounded with so much life made him remember just how little he had left. He knew it would linger on his clothes for days after, like second-hand smoke used to back in the days when you could kill yourself slowly with cigarettes in public places without feeling like a social pariah. He closed his eyes and tried to tune out the cacophony of voices around him and instead concentrated on the fragrant aroma drifting up from the cup of Earl Grey tea sitting on the table in front of him. Like so many things lost in the darkness of his creation as a collector, he had somehow picked up an almost addictive taste for the drink, which before emerging from the big sleep he hadn't even heard of let alone tasted. Just another in a long line of unanswered questions resurrection brought. Randall took a sip of tea and looked around the airport's arrivals lounge. His flight had been miraculously early, so he had taken the time to feed his addiction and watch the world he could never fully be a part of again go about its daily business around him before his contacts arrived to whisk him away in search of Larry McCulloch. He felt invisible at times like these, just an observer like Israel, and the longer he existed the more bitter it made him. He was an outcast, which made it easy, even at times a pleasure to do his job, but still it seemed as if all this humanity, taken so much for granted by those who possessed it, was mocking his soulless existence. These were dangerous times for a collector, in the company of normal folks with nothing to do but think, to dwell on things. If he let himself, he knew it would be all too easy just to snap and let loose such power that would kill everyone in the place. He smiled to himself as he imagined Israel's apoplectic reaction to half a dozen demons tearing up an airport in broad daylight. It would almost be worth the shit storm he would reap just to see the look on the demon's face. The thought soothed him a little, and he took another sip of tea and savored the flavor. He exhaled slowly and felt the all-too-familiar weight on his shoulders again. The big question which gnawed on his subconscious from time to time reared its ugly head again. Mostly Randall loved being a collector, when he didn't think things through too much. Immortality, power to burn, the job had its many perks. But surrounded by all this life, the big question couldn't be ignored. What was so special about me? It was a reasonable question, and it was one Randall had asked himself countless times over the years since his rebirth as a collector of souls. Then he had time on his hands, like now, he would scour his past, to that time before succubus and annoying observer demons, when he was alive and kicking and looking out for number one on the trash-filled streets of New York, Christ, over 90 years ago now. Trying to find that forgotten moment when they notice him. What had the powers that pulled him back from the jaws of death and set him on this path of mayhem and destruction seen in him? What had made him different from those millions of other lowlifes kicking around the city back then? He was bright, sure, and more than a little devious, but Randall had been strictly small time, and no one, even his enemies, would have called him cruel. He had never even killed anyone for Christ's sake. Nothing he had done would surely have warranted such demonic attention. Of course he had asked Israel, but the little shit wouldn't have told him, even if he knew, and increasingly it was clear he did not. The demon made no attempt to cover his jealousy of him, of his echo of humanity, and obviously felt a mere human, albeit a dead dark magic-wielding soul-stealing one, was unworthy of having such power bestowed on it. But there must have been something, some spark of, for want of a better word, evil in him that had marked him as a prime candidate for immortality and mischief-making. But what? Maybe when all this was over and Randall was finally at rest, he would ask the devil just that when he met him. That and spit in his eye, not because he hated what he was, far from it, but just for the hell of it. That and make him look like a schoolgirl just like Israel. Yes, that would be a fitting end to this journey. The thought made Randall smile. He supposed this was as close as a soul collector could get to sacrilege, and if sacrilege can't raise a smile, what can? Excuse me? Randall looked up to see a blonde-haired young man in an expensive-looking suit standing over his shoulder. The collector turned around, but didn't speak. The kid said again a little nervously, "Sorry to bother you, but are you, Mr. Randall?" "Why, yes I am," Randall replied and stood up, offering his hand. The kid took it tentatively and shook it. I'm Charlie Walker. Mr. Lin sent me and my associate to meet you, look after you while you're here? Pleased to meet you, Charlie Walker, Randall said. Charlie moved to pick up Randall's suitcase, but Randall picked it up first. I got it, thanks. Oh, sorry, of course, Charlie said apologetically and just stood there looking at the American as if for instructions. Well? Randall asked after a suitably uncomfortable silence. Shall we? He gestured to the door, but the kid hesitated. Or we could just stand around here all day. This snapped Charlie out of it and he grimaced embarrassed. Oh, Christ, yes, sorry, he said. It's okay. Randall wasn't sure if the kid was just nervous or if he was short of a few cards. Time would tell. After you. Charlie led the way through the arrivals lounge and over to the entrance doors. Randall gave a final look around the place as they left. It was a nice enough place, but still a few dozen demons flying around the place reaping havoc wouldn't go amiss. Charlie grimaced, and for a second Randall thought he'd actually just said that out loud, but as they reached the doors the young man pointed to the weather outside. Just started snowing as we arrived, Charlie said with disgust and buttoned up his coat. Better wrap up, sir, you're in the north now. The automatic doors opened and they were hit by an icy blast. Charlie let out an UFH. And headed outside as if into the Arctic. He didn't know why, but Randall had grown to love the snow since coming back, maybe because somewhere deep in his subconscious it was about as far away from the supposed fires of hell as you could get in normal everyday life here on Earth. Or maybe, he just liked snow now, like Earl Grey tea. Just another knot he would never untie in the puzzle that was his life now. He made a mental note to ask the devil when he finally met him /it/her. What's with the whole snow and Earl Grey thing, fallen one? And by the way, love the dress. You can tell a lot about a person by the way they carry themselves. Often you can tell volumes about someone from their body language without them having to say a word. Bill Fraker leant against the car and watched as Charlie emerged from the airport with a yank. It had just started to snow again, which made Charlie grimace and held his hands above his head in a vain attempt to shield himself from the wintry shower. But the yank, Mr. Randall the guy's name was, just tilted his face up and let the snow fall on it as they walked towards him. He even smiled seeing Charlie's reaction to the weather. He didn't seem to mind the cold at all. The man looked at ease and obviously didn't feel the need to exert any kind of power trip over anyone as he was carrying his own suitcase. Fraker had made sure Charlie knew to offer to carry it, but the man must have declined, which was a good sign in Fraker's book. The last thing he needed was one power-mad crazy hitman lording it over him. They were here to help, not to serve. Although it could be because he kept his guns in the case, that option was much less comforting. Mr. Randall, this is Bill Fraker, Charlie said, eyeing the sky in disgust as they reached the car. The yank gave Fraker a warm smile and shook his hand. Firm grip, not too tight, thought Fraker, still trying to weigh up the man. And none of that, covering your hand with the other in a subconscious show of authority bullshit you get sometimes. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Fraker, said Randall. Mr. Fraker was my father's name. Please, call me Bill. Fraker nodded over to the back of the car and both men walked around to the boot which Fraker had already popped. Bill it is then, Randall said and put his suitcase inside. Shall we? Fraker closed the boot and opened the BMW's back door. Sounds good, Randall gestured to the weather as the three men got in. Randall in the back, Fraker and Walker in the front. Say, Randall continued as Fraker fired up the engine and glided away from the curb. Does it always snow up here? Only when it's not raining, Charlie said, craning his neck around. Welcome to Yorkshire. So, he added, where are you from in the States, Mr. Randall? Fraker winced, as if a hit man was going to answer that. He despaired at that boy sometimes. They had the talk on the drive over here. Don't ask any idiotic questions, keep things polite but professional. The yank is here to do a job, not to make friends. And don't, whatever you do, ask to see the guy's gun. Well, don't ask any idiot questions was already out of the window, only a matter of time before he asks about the gun or worse how many people he had whacked this week. Please, drop the mister, Randall said, skillfully avoiding the question much to Fraker's relief. It's just plain Randall. Fraker pulled the car onto the A46 and headed towards Leeds. He hated driving at the best of times, especially with a VIP in the back. It always made him feel like he was taking his driving test all over again. But as the other alternative was letting Charlie drive, he had no choice. He flicked the window wipers on double speed. The weather was gradually taking a turn for the worse and he was thankful they were in the BMW. This thing could drive through the Arctic without so much as a skid. They drove on in silence for a while. Fraker had the urge to turn on the radio to break the awkwardness, but the Yank seemed happy enough watching the world go by and Charlie was tapping his knees to some imaginary dance track in his head. Still, Fraker thought he should at least try to make conversation. "We've booked a couple of rooms at the Queen's Hotel, in Leeds. It's a decent place but not too over the top. We thought it best to keep things low-key," Fraker said and eased past a slow-moving Volkswagen. He caught a glimpse of the Yank in the rear-view mirror who nodded. "Sounds like I'm in good hands," he said. "Any word on the elusive Mr. McCulloch yet?" Fraker shook his head. "Not so far. To be honest, we've got everyone concentrating on finding his lawyer, a guy named Tommy Whitaker." The Yank seemed to recognize the name. "Good," he said, his tone laid back. "Whitaker's the key. He's weak, afraid. McCulloch will be too well hidden of now. But there's no rush. If you can find Tommy Whitaker, it's just a hop skip and a jump to McCulloch." "So," said Charlie staring absently out of the windscreen. "McCulloch's in deep shit, eh?" Fraker bit his bottom lip and almost punched Charlie in the side of the head. He made a mental note to save it for later when they were alone. He glanced in the rear-view mirror again to see the Yank was actually smiling. "Believe me, Charlie, he should wish he was in deep shit," he said. "Words cannot express the trouble that man is in. You know, his nickname is Lucky?" Charlie said with a snort. "If he gets out of this one," Randall said leaning back in his seat, "you can stick unbelievably in front of that." The three of them laughed out loud. Fraker let out a relieved breath. This guy seemed all right, things might just turn out to be okay after all. A few days in a hotel, all expenses paid, he found himself starting to warm to the idea. But that was still tempered with the fact that this charming American was a hired killer and could quite easily get them all killed or banged up for life. Still, he mused, this was better than scaring the shit out of club owners at 3 a.m. with the kneecap routine. "How was your flight?" Fraker asked. "Mercifully short," Randall replied. "Where did you say we were heading?" "City called Leeds, don't know if you've heard of it." "Leeds, sure," answered Randall. "Used to have one hell of a football team once," Fraker lamented, then added, "That's our football, not yours." "Yeah, I figured." Next to Fraker, Charlie shuddered and had a sour look on his face. "I hate flying me," he said with a frown. Fraker's eyes shot skyward. "Oh, here we go. I don't think Randall is interested in your fear of flying, Charlie." "No, that's okay," Randall said leaning forwards. "Don't like planes, eh Charlie?" Charlie's eyes narrowed as if he was recalling some past aviation horror, which Fraker knew was bollocks. This irrational fear of his was all classic Charlie Walker. Fraker returned his eyes to the road. They would soon be approaching the infamous Leeds Loop road system, which some sadistic city planner had put in place in a supposed attempt to help motorists negotiate around the city center and get easy access to the motorways and city center train station, where unfortunately the Queen's Hotel was slap bang next to.